Meditations on First Philosophy, in which the existence of God and the distinction between the soul and the body are demonstrated. Meditation 1, concerning those things that can be called into doubt. Several years have now passed since I first realized how numerous were the false opinions that in my youth I had taken to be true, and thus how doubtful were all those that I had subsequently built upon them. And thus I realized that once in my life I had to raze everything to the ground and begin again from the original foundations if I wanted to establish anything firm and lasting in the sciences. But the task seemed enormous, and I was waiting until I reached a point in my life that was so timely that no more suitable time for undertaking these plans of action would come to pass. For this reason I procrastinated for so long that I would henceforth be at fault were I to waste the time that remains for carrying out the project by brooding over it. Accordingly, I have today suitably freed my mind of all cares, secured for myself a period of leisurely tranquility, and am withdrawing into solitude. At last, I will apply myself earnestly and unreservedly to this general demolition of my opinions. Yet to bring this about, I will not need to show that all my opinions are false, which is perhaps something I could never accomplish. But reason now persuades me that I should withhold my assent no less carefully from opinions that are not completely certain and indubitable than I would from those that are patently false. For this reason, it will suffice for the rejection of all these opinions if I find in each of them some reason for doubt. Nor therefore need I survey each opinion individually, a task that would be endless. Rather, because undermining the foundations will cause whatever has been built upon them to crumble of its own accord, I will attack straight away those principles which supported everything I once believed. Surely, whatever I had admitted until now as most true, I received either from the senses or through the senses. However, I have noticed that the senses are sometimes deceptive, and it is a mark of prudence never to place our complete trust in those who have deceived us even once. But perhaps, even though the senses do sometimes deceive us when it is a question of very small and distant things, still there are many other matters concerning which one simply cannot doubt, even though they are derived from the very same senses. For example, that I am sitting here next to the fire, wearing my winter dressing gown, that I am holding this sheet of paper in my hands, and the like. But on what grounds could one deny that these hands and this entire body are mine? Unless perhaps I were to liken myself to the insane, whose brains are impaired by such an unrelenting vapor of black bile that they steadfastly insist that they are kings when they are utter paupers, or that they are arrayed in purple robes when they are naked, or that they have heads made of clay, or that they are gourds, or that they are made of glass. But such people are mad, and I would appear no less mad were I to take their behavior as an example for myself. This would all be well and good were I not a man who is accustomed to sleeping at night and to experiencing in my dreams the very same things, or now and then even less plausible ones, as these insane people do when they are awake. How often does my evening slumber persuade me of such ordinary things as these, that I am here, clothed in my dressing gown, seated next to the fireplace, when in fact I am lying undressed in bed. But right now, my eyes are certainly wide awake when I gaze upon this sheet of paper. This head which I am shaking is not heavy with sleep. I extend this hand consciously and deliberately, and I feel it. Such things would not be so distinct for someone who is asleep, as if I did not recall having been deceived on other occasions, even by similar thoughts in my dreams. As I consider these matters more carefully, I see so plainly that there are no definitive signs by which to distinguish being awake from being asleep. As a result, I am becoming quite dizzy, and this dizziness nearly convinces me that I am asleep. Let us assume, then, for the sake of argument, that we are dreaming, and that such particulars as these are not true, that we are opening our eyes, moving our head, and extending our hands. Perhaps we do not even have such hands, or any such body at all. Nevertheless, it must surely be admitted that the things seen during slumber are, as it were, like painted images, which could only have been produced in the likeness of true things, and that therefore at least these general things, eyes, head, hands, and the whole body, are not imaginary things, but are true and exist. For indeed, when painters themselves wish to represent sirens and satyrs by means of especially bizarre forms, they surely cannot assign to them utterly new natures. Rather, they simply fuse together the members of various animals. Or if perhaps they concoct something so utterly novel that nothing like it has ever been seen before, and thus is something utterly fictitious and false, yet certainly at the very least the colors from which they fashion it ought to be true. And by the same token, although even these general things, eyes, head, hands, and the like, could be imaginary, still one has to admit that at least certain other things that are even more simple and universal are true. It is from these components, as if from true colors, that all those images of things that are in our thought are fashioned, be they true or false. This class of things appears to include corporeal nature in general, together with its extension, the shape of extended things, their quantity, that is, their size and number, as well as the place where they exist, the time through which they endure, and the like. Thus it is not improper to conclude from this that physics, astronomy, medicine, and all the other disciplines that are dependent upon the consideration of composite things are doubtful, and that, on the other hand, arithmetic, geometry, and other such disciplines which treat of nothing but the simplest and most general things, and which are indifferent as to whether these things do or do not in fact exist, contain something certain and indubitable. For whether I am asleep or awake, 2 plus 3 makes 5, and a square does not have more than 4 sides. It does not seem possible that such obvious truths should be subject to the suspicion of being false. Be that as it may, there is fixed in my mind a certain opinion of long standing, namely, that there exists a God who is able to do anything, and by whom I, such as I am, have been created. How do I know that he did not bring it about that there is no earth at all, no heavens, no extended thing, no shape, no size, no place, and yet bringing about that all these things appear to me to exist precisely as they do now? Moreover, since I judge that others sometimes make mistakes in matters that they believe they know most perfectly, may I not, in like fashion, be deceived every time I add 2 and 3, or count the sides of a square, or perform an even simpler operation, if that can be imagined? But perhaps God has not willed that I should be deceived in this way, for he is said to be supremely good. Nonetheless, if it were repugnant to his goodness to have created me such that I be deceived all the time, it would also seem foreign to that same goodness to permit me to be deceived even occasionally, but we cannot make this last assertion. Perhaps there are some who would rather deny so powerful a God than believe that everything else is uncertain. Let us not oppose them, rather let us grant that everything said here about God is fictitious. Now, they suppose that I came to be what I am either by fate, or by chance, or by a connected chain of events, or by some other way. But because being deceived and being mistaken appear to be a certain imperfection, the less powerful they take the author of my origin to be, the more probable it will be that I am so imperfect that I am always deceived. I have nothing to say in response to these arguments, but eventually I am forced to admit that there is nothing among the things that I once believed to be true which it is not permissible to doubt, and not out of frivolity or lack of forethought, but for valid and considered reasons. Thus I must be no less careful to withhold assent henceforth, even from these beliefs, than I would from those that are patently false, if I wish to find anything certain. But it is not enough simply to have realized these things. I must take steps to keep myself mindful of them. For long-standing opinions keep returning, and almost against my will, they take advantage of my credulity, as if it were bound over to them by long use and the claims of intimacy. Nor will I ever get out of the habit of assenting to them and believing in them so long as I take them to be exactly what they are, namely in some respects doubtful, as has just now been shown, but nevertheless highly probable, so that it is much more consonant with reason to believe them than to deny them. Hence it seems to me I would do well to deceive myself by turning my will in completely the opposite direction, and pretend for a time that these opinions are wholly false and imaginary, until finally, as if with prejudices weighing down each side equally, no bad habit should turn my judgment any further from the correct perception of things. For indeed I know that meanwhile there is no danger or error in following this procedure, and that it is impossible for me to indulge in too much distrust, since I am now concentrating only on knowledge, not on action. Accordingly, I will not suppose a supremely good God, the source of truth, but rather an evil genius, supremely powerful and clever, who has directed his entire effort at deceiving me. I'll regard the heavens, the air, the earth, color, shapes, sounds, and all external things as nothing but the bedeviling hoaxes of my dreams, with which he lays snares for my credulity. I'll regard myself not as having hands, or eyes, or flesh, or blood, or any senses, but as nevertheless falsely believing that I possess all these things. I'll remain resolute and steadfast in this meditation, and even if it is not within my power to know anything true, it certainly is within my power to take care resolutely to withhold my assent to what is false, lest this deceiver, however powerful, however clever he may be, have any effect on me. But this undertaking is arduous, and a certain laziness brings me back to my customary way of living. I'm not unlike a prisoner who enjoyed an imaginary freedom during his sleep, but when he later begins to suspect that he is dreaming, fears being awakened and nonchalantly conspires with these pleasant illusions. In just the same way, I fall back of my own accord into my old opinions, and dread being awakened, lest the toilsome wakefulness which follows upon a peaceful rest must be spent thenceforward not in the light, but among the inextricable shadows of the difficulties now brought forward. Meditation 2. Concerning the nature of the human mind, that it is better known than the body. Yesterday's meditation has thrown me into such doubts that I can no longer ignore them, yet I fail to see how they are to be resolved. It is as if I had suddenly fallen into a deep whirlpool. I am so tossed about that I can neither touch bottom with my foot nor swim up to the top. Nevertheless, I will work my way up and will once again attempt the same path I entered upon yesterday. I will accomplish this by putting aside everything that admits of the least doubt, as if I had discovered it to be completely false. I will stay on this course until I know something certain, or, if nothing else, until I at least know for certain that nothing is certain. Archimedes sought but one firm and immovable point in order to move the entire earth from one place to another. Just so, great things are also to be hoped for if I succeed in finding just one thing, however slight, that is certain and unshaken. Therefore, I suppose that everything I see is false. I believe that none of what my deceitful memory represents ever existed. I have no senses whatever. Body, shape, extension, movement, and place are all chimeras. What then will be true? Perhaps just the single fact that nothing is certain. But how do I know there is not something else over and above all those things that I have just reviewed, concerning which there is not even the slightest occasion for doubt? Is there not some God, or by whatever name I might call him, who instills these very thoughts in me? But why would I think that, since I myself could perhaps be the author of these thoughts? Am I not then at least something? But I have already denied that I have any senses in any body. Still I hesitate, for what follows from this? Am I so tied to a body and to the senses that I cannot exist without them? But I have persuaded myself that there is absolutely nothing in the world. No sky, no earth, no minds, no bodies. Is it then the case that I too do not exist? But doubtless I did exist if I persuaded myself of something. But there is some deceiver or other who is supremely powerful and supremely sly, and who is always deliberately deceiving me. Then too there is no doubt that I exist if he is deceiving me. And let him do his best at deception, he will never bring it about that I am nothing so long as I shall think that I am something. Thus, after everything has been most carefully weighed, it must finally be established that this pronouncement, I am, I exist, is necessarily true every time I utter it or conceive it in my mind. But I do not yet understand sufficiently what I am, I who now necessarily exist, and so from this point on I must be careful lest I unwittingly mistake something else for myself, and thus err in the very item of knowledge that I claim to be the most certain and evident of all. Thus I will meditate once more on what I once believed myself to be, prior to embarking upon these thoughts. For this reason, then, I will set aside whatever can be weakened, even to the slightest degree, by the arguments brought forward, so that eventually all that remains is precisely nothing but what is certain and unshaken. What then did I used to think I was? A man, of course, but what is a man? Might I not say a rational animal? No, because then I would have to inquire what animal and rational mean, and thus from one question I would slide into many more difficult ones. Nor do I now have enough free time that I want to waste it on subtleties of this sort. Instead, permit me to focus here on what came spontaneously and naturally into my thinking whenever I pondered what I was. Now it occurred to me first that I had a face, hands, arms, and this entire mechanism of bodily members, the very same as are discerned in a corpse, and which are referred to by the name body. It next occurred to me that I took in food, that I walked about, and that I sensed and thought various things. These actions I used to attribute to the soul. But as to what this soul might be, I either did not think about it, or else I imagined a rarefied I know not what, like a wind or a fire or ether, which had been infused into my coarser parts. But as to the body, I was not in any doubt. On the contrary, I was under the impression that I knew its nature distinctly. Were I perhaps tempted to describe this nature as such as I conceived it in my mind, I would have described it thus. By body, I understand all that is capable of being bounded by some shape, of being enclosed in a place, and of filling up a space in such a way as to exclude any other body from it, of being perceived by touch, sight, hearing, taste, or smell, of being moved in several ways, not of course by itself, but by whatever else impinges upon it. For it was my view that the power of self-motion, and likewise of sensing or of thinking, in no way belonged to the nature of the body. Indeed, I used rather to marvel that such faculties were to be found in certain bodies. But now what am I, when I suppose that there is some supremely powerful, and if I may be permitted to say so, malicious deceiver who deliberately tries to fool me in any way he can? Can I not affirm that I possess at least a small measure of all those things which I have already said belong to the nature of the body? I focus my attention on them, I think about them, I review them again, but nothing comes to mind. I am tired of repeating this to no purpose. But what about those things I ascribe to the soul? What about being nourished or moving about? Since I now do not have a body, these are surely nothing but fictions. What about sensing? Surely this too does not take place without a body, and I seem to have sensed in my dreams many things that I later realized I did not sense. What about thinking? Here I make my discovery. Thought exists. It alone cannot be separated from me. I am, I exist, this is certain. But for how long? For as long as I am thinking. For perhaps it could also come to pass that if I were to cease all thinking, I would then utterly cease to exist. At this time I admit nothing that is not necessarily true. I am therefore precisely nothing but a thinking thing, that is, a mind or intellect or understanding or reason, words of whose meanings I was previously ignorant. Yet I am a true thing and am truly existing, but what kind of thing? I have said it already, a thinking thing. What else am I? I still set my imagination in motion. I am not that concatenation of members we call the human body, neither am I even some subtle air infused into these members, nor wind, nor fire, nor a vapor, nor a breath, nor anything I devise for myself. For I have supposed these things to be nothing. The assumption still stands, yet nevertheless I am something. But is it perhaps the case that these very things which I take to be nothing, because they are unknown to me, nevertheless, are in fact no different from that me that I know? This I do not know, and I will not quarrel about it now. I can make a judgment only about things that are known to me. I know that I exist. I ask now, who is this I whom I know? Most certainly, in the strict sense, the knowledge of this I does not depend upon things of whose existence I do not yet have knowledge. Therefore, it is not dependent upon any of those things that I simulate in my imagination. But this word simulate warns me of my error, for I would indeed be simulating were I to imagine that I was something, because imagining is merely the contemplating of the shape or image of a corporeal thing. But I now know with certainty that I am, and also that all these images, and generally everything belonging to the nature of the body, could turn out to be nothing but dreams. Once I have realized this, I would seem to be speaking no less foolishly were I to say, I will use my imagination in order to recognize more distinctly who I am, than were I to say, now I surely am awake, and I see something true, but since I do not yet see it clearly enough, I will deliberately fall asleep so that my dreams might represent it to me more truly and more clearly. Thus I realize that none of what I can grasp by means of the imagination pertains to this knowledge that I have of myself. Moreover, I realize that I must be most diligent about withdrawing my mind from these things so that it can perceive its nature as distinctly as possible. But what then am I? A thing that thinks. What is that? A thing that doubts, understands, affirms, denies, wills, refuses, and also imagines and senses. Indeed, it is no small matter if all these things belong to me, but why should they not belong to me? Is it not the very same I who now doubts almost everything, who nevertheless understands something, who affirms that this one thing is true, who denies other things, who desires to know more, who wishes not to be deceived, who imagines many things even against my will, who also notices many things which appear to come from the senses? What is there in all this that is not every bit as true as the fact that I exist, even if I am always asleep, or even if my Creator makes every effort to mislead me? Which of these things is distinct from my thought? Which of them can be said to be separate from myself? For it is so obvious that it is I who doubt, I who understand, and I who will, that there is nothing by which it could be explained more clearly. But indeed it is also the same I who imagines, for although, perhaps, as I supposed before, absolutely nothing that I imagined is true, still the very power of imagining really does exist and constitutes a part of my thought. Finally, it is this same I who senses, or who is cognizant of bodily things as if through the senses. For example, I now see a light, I hear a noise, I feel heat. These things are false, since I am asleep. Yet I certainly do seem to see, hear, and feel warmth. This cannot be false. Properly speaking, this is what in me is called sensing, but this, precisely so taken, is nothing other than thinking. From these considerations, I am beginning to know a little better what I am, but it still seems, and I cannot resist believing, that corporeal things, those whose images are formed by thought and which the senses themselves examine, are much more distinctly known than this mysterious I, which does not fall within the imagination. And yet it would be strange indeed were I to grasp the very thing I consider to be doubtful, unknown, and foreign to me more distinctly than what is true, what is known, than, in short, myself. But I see what is happening. My mind loves to wander and does not yet permit itself to be restricted within the confines of truth. So be it then. Let us just this once allow it completely free rein, so that a little while later, when the time has come to pull in the reins, the mind may more readily permit itself to be controlled. Let us consider those things which are commonly believed to be the most distinctly grasped of all, namely the bodies we touch and see. Not bodies in general, mind you, for these general perceptions are apt to be somewhat more confused, but one body in particular. Let us take, for instance, this piece of wax. It has been taken quite recently from the honeycomb. It has not yet lost all the honey flavor. It retains some of the scent of the flowers from which it was collected. Its color, shape, size are manifest. It is hard and cold. It is easy to touch. If you rap on it with your knuckle, it will emit a sound. In short, everything is present in it that appears needed to enable a body to be known as distinctly as possible. But notice that as I'm speaking, I am bringing it close to the fire. The remaining traces of the honey flavor are disappearing, the scent is vanishing, the color is changing, the original shape is disappearing, its size is increasing, it is becoming liquid and hot, you can hardly touch it. And now, when you rap on it, it no longer emits any sound. Does the same wax still remain? I must confess that it does. No one denies it, no one thinks otherwise. So what was there in the wax that was so distinctly grasped? Certainly none of the aspects that are reached by means of the senses, for whatever came under the senses of taste, smell, sight, touch, or hearing has now changed, and yet the wax remains. Perhaps the wax is what I now think it is, namely that the wax itself never really was the sweetness of the honey, nor the fragrance of the flowers, nor the whiteness, nor the shape, nor the sound, but instead was a body that a short time ago manifested itself to me in these ways, and now does so in other ways. But just what precisely is this thing that I thus imagine? Let us focus our attention on this and see what remains after we have removed everything that does not belong to the wax, only that it is something extended, flexible, and mutable. But what is it to be flexible and mutable? Is it what my imagination shows it to be, namely that this piece of wax can change from a round to a square shape, or from the latter to a triangular shape? Not at all, for I grasp that the wax is capable of innumerable changes of this sort, even though I am incapable of running through these innumerable changes by using my imagination. Therefore, this insight is not achieved by the faculty of imagination. What is it to be extended? Is this thing's extension also unknown? For it becomes greater in wax that is beginning to melt, greater in boiling wax, and greater still as the heat is increased. And I would not judge correctly what the wax is if I did not believe that it takes on an even greater variety of dimensions than I could ever grasp with the imagination. It remains then for me to concede that I do not grasp what this wax is through the imagination, rather I perceive it through the mind alone. The point I am making refers to this particular piece of wax, for the case of wax in general is clearer still. But what is this piece of wax which is perceived only by the mind? Surely it is the same piece of wax that I see, touch, and imagine. In short, it is the same piece of wax I took it to be from the very beginning. But I need to realize that the perception of the wax is neither a seeing, nor touching, nor an imagining. Nor has it ever been, even though it previously seemed so. Rather, it is an inspection on the part of the mind alone. This inspection can be imperfect and confused, as it was before, or clear and distinct as it is now, depending on how closely I pay attention to the things in which the piece of wax consists. But meanwhile I marvel at how prone my mind is to errors, for although I am considering these things within myself, silently and without words, nevertheless I seize upon words themselves, and I am nearly deceived by the ways in which people commonly speak. For we say that we see the wax itself, if it is present, and not that we judge it to be present, from its color or shape, whence I might conclude straight away that I know the wax through the vision had by the eye, and not through an inspection on the part of the mind alone. But then, were I perchance to look out my window and observe men crossing the square, I would ordinarily say I see the men themselves, just as I say I see the wax. But what do I see aside from hats and clothes, which could conceal automata? Yet I judge them to be men. Thus, what I thought I had seen with my eyes, I actually grasped solely with the faculty of judgment which is in my mind. But a person who seeks to know more than the common crowd ought to be ashamed of himself for looking for doubt in common ways of speaking. Let us then go forward and inquire when it was that I perceived more perfectly and evidently what the piece of wax was. Was it when I first saw it and believed I knew it by the external sense, or at least by the so-called common sense, that is, the power of imagination? Or do I have more perfect knowledge now, when I have diligently examined both what the wax is and how it is known? Surely it is absurd to be in doubt about this matter, for what was there in my initial perception that was distinct? What was there that any animal seemed incapable of possessing? But indeed, when I distinguish the wax from its external forms, as if stripping it of its clothing, and look at the wax in its nakedness, then, even though there can be still an error in my judgment, nevertheless I cannot perceive it thus without a human mind. But what am I to say about this mind that is about myself? For as yet I admit nothing else to be in me over and above the mind. What, I ask, am I who seem to perceive this wax so distinctly? Do I not know myself not only much more truly and with greater certainty, but also much more distinctly and evidently? For if I judge that the wax exists from the fact that I see it, certainly from this same fact that I see the wax, it follows much more evidently that I myself exist. For it could happen that what I see is not truly wax. It could happen that I have no eyes with which to see anything, but it is utterly impossible that, while I see or think I see, I do not now distinguish these two. I, who think, am not something. Likewise, if I judge that the wax exists from the fact that I touch it, the same outcome will again obtain, namely that I exist. If I judge that the wax exists from the fact that I imagine it, or for any other reason, plainly the same thing follows. But what I note regarding the wax applies to everything else that is external to me. Furthermore, if my perception of the wax seemed more distinct after it became known to me, not only on account of sight or touch, but on account of many reasons, one has to admit how much more distinctly I am now known to myself. For there is not a single consideration that can aid in my perception of the wax or of any other body that fails to make even more manifest the nature of my mind. But there are still so many other things in the mind itself on the basis of which my knowledge of it can be rendered more distinctly that it seems hardly worth enumerating those things which emanate to it from the body. But lo and behold, I have returned on my own where I wanted to be. For since I now know that even bodies are not, properly speaking, perceived by the senses or by the faculty of imagination, but by the intellect alone, and that they are not perceived through their being touched or seen, but only through their being understood, I manifestly know that nothing can be perceived more easily and more evidently than my own mind. But since the tendency to hang on to long-held beliefs cannot be put aside so quickly, I want to stop here so that by the length of my meditation this new knowledge may be more deeply impressed upon my memory. Meditation 3, concerning God, that He exists. I will now shut my eyes, stop up my ears, and withdraw all my senses. I will also blot out from my thoughts all images of corporeal things, or rather, since the latter is hardly possible, I'll regard these images as empty, false, and worthless, and as I converse with myself alone and look more deeply into myself, I'll attempt to render myself gradually better known and more familiar to myself. I am a thing that thinks, that is to say, a thing that doubts, affirms, denies, understands a few things, is ignorant of many things, wills, refrains from willing, and also imagines and senses. For as I observed earlier, even though these things that I sense or imagine may perhaps be nothing at all outside me, nevertheless I am certain that these modes of thinking, which are cases of what I call sensing and imagining, insofar as they are merely modes of thinking, do exist within me. In these few words I have reviewed everything I truly know, or at least what so far I have noticed that I know. Now I will ponder more carefully to see whether perhaps there may be other things belonging to me that up until now I have failed to notice. I'm certain that I am a thinking thing, but do I not therefore also know what is required for me to be certain of anything? Surely in this first instance of knowledge there's nothing but a certain clear and distinct perception of what I affirm. Yet this would hardly be enough to render me certain of the truth of a thing, if it could ever happen that something that I perceive so clearly and distinctly were false. And thus I now seem able to posit as a general rule that everything I very clearly and distinctly perceive is true. Be that as it may, I have previously admitted many things as wholly certain and evident that nevertheless I later discovered to be doubtful. What sort of things were these? Why, the earth, the sky, the stars, and all the other things I perceive by means of the senses. But what was it about these things that I clearly perceived? Surely the fact that the ideas or the thoughts of these things were hovering before my mind. But even now, I do not deny that these ideas are in me, yet there was something else I used to affirm, which, owing to my habitual tendency to believe it, I used to think was something I clearly perceived, even though I actually did not perceive it at all. Namely, that certain things existed outside me, things from which those ideas proceeded and which those ideas completely resembled. But on this point I was mistaken, or rather, if my judgment were a true one, it was not the result of the force of my perception. But what about when I considered something very simple and easy in the areas of arithmetic or geometry, for example, that 2 plus 3 makes 5 and the like? Did I not intuit them at least clearly enough so as to affirm them as true? To be sure, I did decide later on that I must doubt these things, but that was only because it occurred to me that some God could perhaps have given me a nature such that I might be deceived even about matters that seemed most evident. But whenever this preconceived opinion about the supreme power of God occurs to me, I cannot help admitting that, were He to wish it, it would be easy for Him to cause me to err even in those matters that I think I intuit as clearly as possible with the eyes of the mind. On the other hand, whenever I turn my attention to those very things that I think I perceive with such great clarity, I am so completely persuaded by them that I spontaneously blurt out these words. Let anyone who can do so deceive me, so long as I think that I am something. He will never bring it about that I am nothing, nor will he one day make it true that I never existed, for it is true now that I do exist, nor will he even bring it about that perhaps 2 plus 3 might equal more or less than 5, or similar items in which I recognize an obvious contradiction. And certainly, because I have no reason for thinking that there is a God who is a deceiver, and of course I do not yet sufficiently know whether there even is a God, the basis for doubting, depending as it does merely on the above hypothesis, is very tenuous and, so to speak, metaphysical. But in order to remove even this basis for doubt, I should at the first opportunity inquire whether there is a God, and if there is, whether or not he can be a deceiver. For if I am ignorant of this, it appears I am never capable of being completely certain about anything else. However, at this stage, good order seems to demand that I first group all my thoughts into certain classes and ask in which of them truth or falsity properly resides. Some of these thoughts are like images of things. To these alone does the word idea properly apply, as when I think of a man or a chimera or the sky or an angel or God. Again, there are other thoughts that take different forms. For example, when I will or fear or affirm or deny, there is always something that I grasp as the subject of my thought, yet I embrace in my thought something more than the likeness of that thing. Some of these thoughts are called volitions or affects, while others are called judgments. Now, as far as ideas are concerned, if they are considered alone and in their own right without being referred to something else, they cannot, properly speaking, be false. For whether it is a she-goat or a chimera that I am imagining, it is no less true that I imagine the one than the other. Moreover, we need not fear that there is falsity in the will itself or in the affects, for although I can choose evil things or even things that are utterly non-existent, I cannot conclude from this that it is untrue that I do choose these things. Thus there remain only judgments in which I must take care not to be mistaken. Now, the principal and most frequent error to be found in judgments consists in the fact that I judge that the ideas which are in me are similar to or in conformity with certain things outside me. Obviously, if I were to consider these ideas merely as certain modes of my thought, and were not to refer them to anything else, they could hardly give me any subject matter for error. Among these ideas, some appear to me to be innate, some adventitious, and some produced by me. For I understand what a thing is, what truth is, what thought is, and I appear to have derived this exclusively from my very own nature. But say I am now hearing a noise, or looking at the sun, or feeling the fire. Up until now I judged that these things proceeded from certain things outside me, and finally that sirens, hippographs, and the like are made by me. Or perhaps I can even think of all these ideas as being adventitious, or as being innate, or as fabrications, for I have not yet clearly ascertained their true origin. But here I must inquire particularly into those ideas that I believe to be derived from things existing outside me. Just what reason do I have for believing that these ideas resemble those things? Well, I do seem to have been so taught by nature. Moreover, I do know from experience that these ideas do not depend upon my will, nor consequently upon myself, for I often notice them even against my will. Now, for example, whether or not I will it, I feel heat. It is for this reason that I believe this feeling or idea of heat comes to me from something other than myself, namely from the heat of the fire by which I am sitting. Nothing is more obvious than the judgment that this thing is sending its likeness rather than something else into me. I will now see whether these reasons are powerful enough. When I say here, I have been so taught by nature, all I have in mind is that I am driven by a spontaneous impulse to believe this, and not that some light of nature is showing me that it is true. These are two very different things. For whatever is shown me by this light of nature, for example, that from the fact that I doubt, it follows that I am, and the like, cannot in any way be doubtful, this is owing to the fact that there can be no other faculty that I can trust as much as this light, and which could teach that these things are not true. But as far as natural impulses are concerned, in the past I have often judged myself to have been driven by them to make the poorer choice when it was a question of choosing a good, and I fail to see why I should place any greater faith in them than in other matters. Again, although these ideas do not depend upon my will, it does not follow that they necessarily proceed from things existing outside me. For just as these impulses about which I spoke just now seem to be different from my will, even though they are in me, so too perhaps there is also in me some other faculty, one not yet sufficiently known to me, which produces these ideas, just as it has always seemed up to now that ideas are formed in me without any help from external things when I am asleep. And finally, even if these ideas did proceed from things other than myself, it does not therefore follow that they must resemble those things. Indeed, it seems I have frequently noticed a vast difference in many respects. For example, I find within myself two distinct ideas of the sun. One idea is drawn, as it were, from the senses. Now it is this idea which, of all those that I take to be derived from outside me, is most in need of examination. By means of this idea, the sun appears to me to be quite small. But there is another idea, one derived from astronomical reasoning, that is, it is elicited from certain notions that are innate in me, or else is fashioned by me in some other way. Through this idea, the sun is shown to be several times larger than the earth. Both ideas surely cannot resemble the same sun existing outside me, and reason convinces me that the idea that seems to have emanated from the sun itself from so close is the very one that least resembles the sun. All these points demonstrate sufficiently that up to this point it was not a well-founded judgment, but only a blind impulse that formed the basis of my belief that things existing outside me send ideas or images of themselves to me through the sense organs or by some other means. But still another way occurs to me for inquiring whether some of the things of which there are ideas in me do exist outside me. Insofar as these ideas are merely modes of thought, I see no inequality among them. They all seem to proceed from me in the same manner. But insofar as one idea represents one thing and another idea another thing, it is obvious that they do differ very greatly from one another. Unquestionably, those ideas that display substances to me are something more, and if I may say so, contain within themselves more objective reality than those which represent only modes or accidents. Again, the idea that enables me to understand a supreme deity, eternal, infinite, omniscient, omnipotent, the creator of all things other than himself, clearly has more objective reality within it than do those ideas through which finite substances are displayed. Now, it is indeed evident by the light of nature that there must be at least as much reality in the efficient and total cause as there is in the effect of that same cause. For whence, I ask, could an effect get its reality if not from its cause? And how could the cause give that reality to the effect, unless it also possesses that reality? Hence it follows that something cannot come into being out of nothing, and also that what is more perfect, that is, what contains in itself more reality, cannot come into being from what is less perfect. But this is manifestly true not merely for those effects whose reality is actual or formal, but also for ideas in which only objective reality is concerned. For example, not only can a stone which did not exist previously not now begin to exist unless it is produced by something in which there is, either formally or immanently, everything that is in the stone, nor heat be introduced into a subject which was not already hot unless it is done by something that is of at least as perfect an order as heat, and the same for the rest. But it is also true that there can be in me no idea of heat or of a stone unless it is placed in me by some cause that has at least as much reality as I conceive to be in the heat or in the stone. For although this cause conveys none of its actual or formal reality to my idea, it should not be thought for that reason that it must be less real. Rather, the very nature of an idea is such that of itself it needs no formal reality other than what it borrows from my thought, of which it is a mode. But that a particular idea contains this as opposed to that objective reality is surely owing to some cause in which there is at least as much formal reality as there is objective reality contained in the idea. For if we assume that something is found in the idea that was not in its cause, then the idea gets that something from nothing. Yet as imperfect a mode of being as this is by which a thing exists in the intellect objectively through an idea, nevertheless it is plainly not nothing, hence it cannot get its being from nothing. Moreover, even though the reality that I am considering in my ideas is merely objective reality, I ought not on that account to suspect that there is no need for the same reality to be formally in the causes of these ideas, but that it suffices for it to be in them objectively. For just as the objective mode of being belongs to the ideas by their very nature, so the formal mode of belonging belongs to the causes of ideas, at least to the first and preeminent ones by their very nature. And although one idea can perhaps issue from another, nevertheless no infinite regress is permitted here. Eventually some first idea must be reached whose cause is a sort of archetype that contains formally all the reality that is in the idea merely objectively. Thus it is clear to me by the light of nature that the ideas that are in me are like images that can easily fail to match the perfection of the things from which they have been drawn, but which can contain nothing greater or more perfect. And the longer and more attentively I examine all these points, the more clearly and distinctly I know they are true. But what am I ultimately to conclude? If the objective reality of any of my ideas is found to be so great that I am certain that the same reality was not in me, either formally or immanently, and that therefore I myself cannot be the cause of the idea, then it necessarily follows that I am not alone in the world, but that something else, which is the cause of this idea, also exists. But if no such idea is found in me, I will have no argument whatsoever to make me certain of the existence of anything other than myself, for I have conscientiously reviewed all these arguments, and so far I have been unable to find any other. Among my ideas, in addition to the one that displays me to myself, about which there can be no difficulty at this point, are others that represent God, corporeal and inanimate things, angels, animals, and finally other men like myself. As to the ideas that display other men or animals or angels, I easily understand that they could be fashioned from the ideas that I have of myself, of corporeal things, and of God, even if no man except myself, no animals, and no angels existed in the world. As to the ideas of corporeal things, there is nothing in them that is so great that it seems incapable of having originated from me. For if I investigate them thoroughly and examine each one individually in the way I examined the idea of wax yesterday, I notice that there are only a very few things in them that I perceive clearly and distinctly, namely size or extension and length, breadth and depth. shape, which arises from the limits of this extension, position, which various things possessing shape have in relation to one another, and motion or alteration in position. To these can be added substance, duration, and number, but as for the remaining items such as light and color, sounds, odors, tastes, heat and cold, and other tactile qualities, I think of these only in a very confused and obscure manner, to the extent that I do not even know whether they are true or false, that is, whether the ideas I have of them are ideas of things or ideas of non-things. For although a short time ago I noted that falsity, properly so called, or formal falsity, is to be found only in judgments, nevertheless there is another kind of falsity called material falsity, which is found in ideas whenever they represent a non-thing as if it were a thing. For example, the ideas I have of heat and cold fall so far short of being clear and distinct that I cannot tell from them whether cold is merely the privation of heat, or whether heat is the privation of cold, or whether both are real qualities, or whether neither is. And because ideas can only be, as it were, of things, if it is true that cold is merely the absence of heat, then an idea that represents cold to me as something real and positive will not inappropriately be called false. The same holds for other similar ideas. Assuredly, I need not assign to these ideas an author distinct from myself, for if they were false, that is, if they were to represent non-things, I know by the light of nature that they proceed from nothing, that is, they are in me for no other reason than that something is lacking in my nature, and that my nature is not entirely perfect. If, on the other hand, these ideas are true, then because they exhibit so little reality to me that I cannot distinguish it from a non-thing, I see no reason why they cannot get their being from me. As for what is clear and distinct in the ideas of corporeal things, it appears I could have borrowed some of these from the idea of myself, namely, substance, duration, number, and whatever else there may be of this type. For instance, I think that a stone is a substance, that is to say, a thing that is suitable for existing in itself, and likewise I think that I too am a substance, despite the fact that I conceive myself to be a thinking thing and not an extended thing, whereas I conceive of a stone as an extended thing and not a thinking thing. And hence there is the greatest diversity between these two concepts. Nevertheless, they seem to agree with one another when considered under the rubric of substance. Furthermore, I perceive that I now exist, and I recall that I have previously existed for some time, and I have various thoughts and know how many of them there are. It is in doing these things that I acquire the ideas of duration and number, which I can then apply to other things. However, none of the other components out of which the ideas of corporeal things are fashioned, namely extension, shape, position, and motion, are contained in me formally, since I am merely a thinking thing. But since these are only certain modes of a substance, whereas I am a substance, it seems possible that they are contained in me eminently. Thus there remains only the idea of God. I must consider whether there is anything in this idea that could not have originated from me. I understand by the name God a certain substance that is infinite, independent, supremely intelligent, supremely powerful, and that created me along with everything else that exists, if anything else exists. Indeed, all these are such that the more carefully I focus my attention on them, the less possible it seems they could have arisen from myself alone. Thus, from what has been said, I must conclude that God necessarily exists. For although the idea of substance is in me by virtue of the fact that I am a substance, that fact is not sufficient to explain my having the idea of an infinite substance, since I am finite, unless this idea proceeded from some substance which really was infinite. Nor should I think that I do not perceive the infinite by means of a true idea, but only through a negation of the finite, just as I perceive rest and darkness by means of a negation of motion and light. On the contrary, I clearly understand that there is more reality in an infinite substance than there is in a finite one. Thus the perception of the infinite is somehow prior in me to the perception of the finite. That is, my perception of God is prior to my perception of myself. For how would I understand that I doubt and that I desire, that is, that I lack something, and that I am not wholly perfect, unless there were some idea in me of a more perfect being, by comparison with which I might recognize my defects? Nor can it be said that this idea of God is perhaps materially false, and thus can originate from nothing, as I remarked just now about the ideas of heat and cold and the like. On the contrary, because it is the most clear and distinct, and because it contains more objective reality than any other idea, no idea is in and of itself truer and has less of a basis for being suspected of falsehood. I maintain that this idea of a being that is supremely perfect and infinite is true in the highest degree, for although I could perhaps pretend that such a being does not exist, nevertheless I could not pretend that the idea of such a being discloses to me nothing real, as was the case with the idea of cold which I referred to earlier. It is indeed an idea that is utterly clear and distinct. For whatever I clearly and distinctly perceive to be real and true and to involve some perfection is wholly contained in that idea. It is no objection that I do not comprehend the infinite, or that there are countless other things in God that I can in no way either comprehend or perhaps even touch with my thought. For the nature of the infinite is such that it is not comprehended by a being such as I, who am finite. And it is sufficient that I understand this very point and judge that all those things that I clearly perceive and that I know to contain some perfection, and perhaps even countless other things of which I am ignorant, are in God either formally or eminently. The result is that of all the ideas that are in me, the idea that I have of God is the most true, the most clear and distinct. But perhaps I am something greater than I myself understand. Perhaps all these perfections that I am attributing to God are somehow in me, potentially, although they do not yet assert themselves and are not yet actualized. For I now observe that my knowledge is gradually being increased, and I see nothing standing in the way of its being increased more and more to infinity. Moreover, I see no reason why, with my knowledge that thus increased, I could not acquire all the remaining perfections of God. And finally, if the potential for these perfections is in me already, I see no reason why this potential would not suffice to produce the idea of these perfections. Yet none of these things can be the case. First, while it is true that my knowledge is gradually being increased and that there are many things in me potentially that are not yet actual, nevertheless none of these pertains to the idea of God, in which there is nothing whatever that is potential. Indeed, this gradual increase is itself a most certain proof of imperfection. Moreover, although my knowledge may always increase more and more, nevertheless I understand that this knowledge will never by this means be actually infinite, because it will never reach a point where it is incapable of greater increase. On the contrary, I judge God to be actually infinite, so that nothing can be added to his perfection. Finally, I perceive that the objective being of an idea cannot be produced by a merely potential being, which, strictly speaking, is nothing, but only by an actual or formal being. Indeed, there is nothing in all these things that is not manifest by the light of nature to one who is conscientious and attentive. But when I am less attentive, and the images of sensible things blind the mind's eye, I do not so easily recall why the idea of a being more perfect than me necessarily proceeds from a being that is really more perfect. This being the case, it is appropriate to ask further whether I myself who have this idea could exist if such a being did not exist. From what source, then, do I derive my existence? Why, from myself, or from my parents, or from whatever other things there are that are less perfect than God, for nothing more perfect than God, or even as perfect as God, can be thought or imagined. But if I got my being from myself, I would not doubt, nor would I desire, nor would I lack anything at all, for I would have given myself all the perfections of which I have some idea. In so doing, I myself would be God. I must not think that the things I lack could perhaps be more difficult to acquire than the ones I have now. On the contrary, it is obvious that it would have been much more difficult for me, that is, a thing or substance that thinks, to emerge out of nothing than it would be to acquire the knowledge of many things about which I am ignorant, these items of knowledge being merely accidents of that substance. Certainly, if I got this greater thing from myself, I could not have denied myself at least those things that can be had more easily. Nor would I have denied myself any of those or other things that are perceived to be contained in the idea of God, for surely none of them seem to me more difficult to bring about. But if any of them were more difficult to bring about, they would certainly also seem more difficult to me, even if the remaining ones that I possess I got for myself, since it would be on account of them that I would experience that my power is limited. Nor am I avoiding the force of these arguments if I suppose that perhaps I have always existed as I do now, as if it then followed that no author of my existence need be sought. For because the entire span of one's life can be divided into countless parts, each one wholly independent of the rest, it does not follow from the fact that I existed a short time ago that I must exist now, unless some cause, as it were, creates me all over again at this moment, that is to say, which preserves me. For it is obvious to one who pays close attention to the nature of time that plainly the same force and action are needed to preserve anything at each individual moment that it lasts as would be required to create that same thing anew, were it not yet in existence. Thus conservation differs from creation solely by virtue of a distinction of reason. This too is one of those things that are manifest by the light of nature. Therefore, I must now ask myself whether I possess some power by which I can bring it about that I myself, who now exist, will also exist a little later on. For since I am nothing but a thinking thing, or at least since I am now dealing simply and precisely with that part of me which is a thinking thing, if such a power were in me, then I would certainly be aware of it. But I observe that there is no such power, and from this very fact I know most clearly that I depend upon some being other than myself. But perhaps this being is not God, and I have been produced either by my parents or by some other causes less perfect than God. On the contrary, as I said before, it is obvious that there must be at least as much in the cause as there is in the effect. Thus, regardless of what it is that eventually is assigned as my cause, because I am a thinking thing and have within me a certain idea of God, it must be granted that what caused me is also a thinking thing, and it too has an idea of all the perfections which I attribute to God. And I can again inquire of this cause whether it got its existence from itself or from another cause. For if it got its existence from itself, it is evident from what has been said that it is itself God, because having the power of existing in and of itself is unquestionably also has the power of actually possessing all the perfections of which it has in itself an idea. That is, all the perfections that I conceive to be in God. However, if it got its existence from another cause, I'll once again inquire in similar fashion about this other cause, whether it got its existence from itself or from another cause, until finally I arrive at the ultimate cause, which will be God. For it is apparent enough that there can be no infinite regress here, especially since I am not dealing here merely with the cause that once produced me, but also and most especially with the cause that preserves me at the present time. Nor can one fancy that perhaps several partial causes have concurred in bringing me into being, and that have taken the ideas of the various perfections I attribute to God from a variety of causes, so that all of these perfections are found somewhere in the universe, but not all joined together in a single being, God. On the contrary, the unity, the simplicity, that is, the inseparability of all those features that are in God is one of the chief perfections that I understand to be in him. Certainly the idea of the unity of all his perfections could not have been placed in me by any cause from which I did not also get the ideas of the other perfections, for neither could some cause have made me understand them joined together and inseparable from one another, unless it also caused me to recognize what they were. Finally, as to my parents, even if everything that I ever believed about them were true, still it is certainly not they who preserve me. Nor is it they who in any way brought me into being, insofar as I am a thinking thing. Rather, they merely placed certain dispositions in the matter which I judged to contain me, that is, a mind which now is the only thing I take myself to be. And thus there can be no difficulty here concerning my parents. Indeed, I have no choice but to conclude that the mere fact of my existing and of there being in me an idea of a most perfect being, that is God, demonstrates most evidently that God too exists. All that remains for me is to ask how I received this idea of God, for I did not draw it from the senses. It never came upon me unexpectedly, as is usually the case with the ideas of sensible things when these things present themselves, or seem to present themselves, to the external sense organs. Nor was it by me, for I plainly can neither subtract anything from it nor add anything to it. Thus the only option remaining is that this idea is innate in me, just as the idea of myself is innate in me. To be sure, it is not astonishing that in creating me, God should have endowed me with this idea, so that it would be like the mark of the craftsman impressed upon his work, although this mark need not be something distinct from the work itself. But the mere fact that God created me makes it highly plausible that I have somehow been made in his image and likeness, and that I perceive this likeness, in which the idea of God is contained, by means of the same faculty by which I perceive myself. That is, when I turn the mind's eye toward myself, I understand not only that I am something incomplete and dependent upon another, something aspiring indefinitely for greater and greater or better things, but also that the being on whom I depend has in himself all those greater things, not merely indefinitely and potentially, but infinitely and actually, and thus that he is God. The whole force of the argument rests on the fact that I recognize that it would be impossible for me to exist, being of such a nature as I am, namely having in me the idea of God, unless God did in fact exist. God, I say, that same being, the idea of whom is in me, a being having all those perfections that I cannot comprehend, but can somehow touch with my thought, and a being subject to no defects whatever. From these considerations it is quite obvious that he cannot be a deceiver, for it is manifest by the light of nature that all fraud and deception depend on some defect. But before examining this idea more closely and at the same time inquiring into other truths that can be gathered from it, at this point I want to spend some time contemplating this God, to ponder his attributes, and so far as the eye of my darkened mind can take me, to gaze upon, to admire, and to adore the beauty of this immense light. For just as we believe by faith that the greatest felicity of the next life consists solely in this contemplation of the divine majesty, so too we now experience that from the same contemplation, although it is much less perfect, the greatest pleasure of which we are capable in this life can be perceived. Meditation 4, concerning the true and the false. Lately I have become accustomed to withdrawing my mind from the senses, and I have carefully taken note of the fact that very few things are truly perceived regarding corporeal things, although a great many more things are known regarding the human mind, and still many more things regarding God. The upshot is that I now have no difficulty directing my thought away from things that can be imagined to things that can be grasped only by the understanding and are wholly separate from matter. In fact, the idea I clearly have of the human mind insofar as it is a thinking thing not extended in length, breadth, or depth, and having nothing else from the body, is far more distinct than the idea of any corporeal thing. And when I take note of the fact that I doubt, or I am a thing that is incomplete and dependent, there comes to mind a clear and distinct idea of a being that is independent and complete, that is, an idea of God. And from the mere fact that such an idea is in me, or that I who have this idea exist, I draw the obvious conclusion that God also exists, and that my existence depends entirely upon him at each and every moment. This conclusion is so obvious that I am confident that the human mind can know nothing more evident or more certain. And now I seem to see a way by which I might progress from this contemplation of the true God, in whom, namely, are hidden all the treasures of the sciences and wisdom, to the knowledge of other things. To begin with, I acknowledge that it is impossible for God ever to deceive me, for trickery or deception is always indicative of some imperfection, and although the ability to deceive seems to be an indication of cleverness or power, the will to deceive undoubtedly attests to maliciousness or weakness. Accordingly, deception is incompatible with God. Next, I experience that there is in me a certain faculty of judgment, which, like everything else that is in me, I undoubtedly receive from God, and since he does not wish to deceive me, he assuredly has not given me the sort of faculty with which I could ever make a mistake when I use it properly. No doubt regarding this matter would remain, but for the fact that it seems to follow from this that I am never capable of making a mistake. For if everything that is in me I got from God, and he gave me no faculty for making mistakes, it seems I am incapable of ever erring. And thus, so long as I think exclusively about God and focus my attention exclusively on him, I discern no cause of error or falsity. But once I turn my attention back on myself, I nevertheless experience that I am subject to countless errors. As I seek a cause of these errors, I notice that passing before me is not only a real and positive idea of God, that is, of a supremely perfect being, but also, as it were, a certain negative idea of nothingness, that is, of what is at the greatest possible distance from any perfection, and that I have been so constituted as a kind of middle ground between God and nothingness, or between the Supreme Being and non-being. Thus, insofar as I have been created by the Supreme Being, there is nothing in me by means of which I might be deceived or be led into error, but insofar as I participate in nothingness or non-being, that is, insofar as I am not the Supreme Being and lack a great many things, it is not surprising that I make mistakes. Thus, I certainly understand that error as such is not something real that depends upon God, but rather is merely a defect. And thus there is no need to account for my errors by positing a faculty given to me by God for this purpose. Rather, it just so happens that I make mistakes because the faculty of judging the truth which I got from God is not, in my case, infinite. Still, this is not yet altogether satisfactory, for error is not a pure negation, but rather a privation or a lack of some knowledge that somehow ought to be in me. And when I attend to the nature of God, it seems impossible that he would have placed in me a faculty that is not perfect in its kind, or that is lacking some perfection it ought to have. For if it is true that the more expert the craftsman, the more perfect the works he produces, what can that supreme creator of all things make that is not perfect in all respects? No doubt God could have created me such that I never erred. No doubt, again, God always wills what is best. Is it then better that I should be in error rather than not? As I mull these things over more carefully, it occurs to me first that there is no reason to marvel at the fact that God should bring about certain things that the reasons for which I do not understand. Nor is his existence therefore to be doubted because I happen to experience other things of which I fail to grasp why and how he made them. For since I know now that my nature is very weak and limited, whereas the nature of God is immense, incomprehensible, and infinite, this is sufficient for me also to know that he can make innumerable things whose causes escape me. For this reason alone, the entire class of causes which people customarily derive from a thing's end, I judge to be utterly useless in physics. It is not without rashness that I think myself capable of inquiring into the ends of God. It also occurs to me that whenever we ask whether the works of God are perfect, we should keep in view not simply some one creature in isolation from the rest, but the universe as a whole. For perhaps something might rightfully appear very imperfect if it were all by itself, and yet be most perfect to the extent that it has the status of a part in the universe. And although subsequent to having decided to doubt everything, I have come to know with certainty only that I and God exist, nevertheless, after having taken note of the immense power of God, I cannot deny that many other things have been made by him, or at least could have been made by him. Thus, I may have the status of a part in the universal scheme of things. Next, as I focus more closely on myself and inquire into the nature of my errors, the only things that are indicative of some imperfection in me, I note that these errors depend on the simultaneous concurrence of two causes, the faculty of knowing that is in me and the faculty of choosing, that is, the free choice of the will, in other words, simultaneously on the intellect and will. Through the intellect alone, I merely perceive ideas, about which I can render a judgment. Strictly speaking, no error is to be found in the intellect when properly viewed in this manner. For although perhaps there may exist countless things about which I have no idea, nevertheless it must not be said that, strictly speaking, I am deprived of these ideas, but only that I lack them in a negative sense. This is because I cannot adduce an argument to prove that God ought to have given me a greater faculty of knowing than he did. No matter how expert a craftsman I understand him to be, still I do not for that reason believe he ought to have bestowed on each one of his works all the perfections that he can put into some. Nor, on the other hand, can I complain that the will or free choice I have received from God is insufficiently ample or perfect, since I experience that it is limited by no boundaries whatever. In fact, it seems to be especially worth noting that no other things in me are so perfect or so great, but that I understand that they can be still more perfect or greater. If, for example, I consider the faculty of understanding, I immediately recognize that in my case it is very small and quite limited, and that at the very same time, I form an idea of another much greater faculty of understanding, in fact, an understanding which is consummately great and infinite. And from the fact that I can form an idea of this faculty, I perceive that it pertains to the nature of God. Similarly, were I to examine the faculty of memory or imagination, or any of the other faculties, I would understand that in my case, each of these is without exception feeble and limited, whereas in the case of God, I understand each faculty to be boundless. It is only the will or free choice that I experience to be so great in me that I cannot grasp the idea of any greater faculty. This is so much the case that the will is the chief basis for my understanding that I bear a certain image and likeness of God. For although the faculty of willing is incomparably greater in God than it is in me, both by virtue of the knowledge and power that are joined to it and that render it more resolute and efficacious, and by virtue of its object, inasmuch as the divine will stretches over a greater number of things, nevertheless, when viewed in itself, formally and precisely, God's faculty of willing does not appear to be any greater. This is owing to the fact that willing is merely a matter of being able to do or not do the same thing. That is, of being able to affirm or deny, to pursue or to shun. Or better still, the will consists solely in the fact that when something is proposed to us by our intellect, either to affirm or deny, to pursue or to shun, we are moved in such a way that we sense that we are determined to it by no external force. In order to be free, I need not be capable of being moved in each direction. On the contrary, the more I am inclined toward one direction, either because I clearly understand that there is in it an aspect of the good and the true, or because God has thus disposed the inner recesses of my thought, the more freely do I choose that direction. Nor indeed does divine grace or natural knowledge ever diminish one's freedom, rather they increase and strengthen it. However, the indifference that I experience when there is no reason moving me more in one direction than in another is the lowest grade of freedom. It is indicative of not of any perfection and freedom, but rather of a defect, that is, a certain negation in knowledge. Were I always to see clearly what is true and good, I would never deliberate about what is to be judged or chosen. In that event, although I would be entirely free, I could never be indifferent. But from these considerations I perceive that the power of willing, which I got from God, is not, taken by itself, the cause of my errors, for it is most ample as well as perfect in its kind, nor is my power of understanding the cause of my errors. For since I got my power of understanding from God, whatever I understand, I doubtless understand rightly, and it is impossible for me to be deceived in this. What then is the source of my errors? They are owing simply to the fact that, since the will extends further than the intellect, I do not contain the will within the same boundaries. Rather, I also extend it to things I do not understand. Because the will is indifferent in regard to such matters, it easily turns away from the true and the good, and in this way I am deceived and I sin. For example, during these last few days I was examining whether anything in the world exists, and I noticed that, from the very fact that I was making this examination, it obviously followed that I exist. Nevertheless, I could not help judging that what I understood so clearly was true, not that I was coerced into making this judgment because of some external force, but because a great light in my intellect gave way to a great inclination in my will, and the less indifferent I was, the more spontaneously and freely did I believe it. But now, in addition to my knowing that I exist, insofar as I am a certain thinking thing, I also observe a certain idea of corporeal nature. It happens that I am in doubt as to whether the thinking nature which is in me, or rather which I am, is something different from this corporeal nature, or whether both natures are one and the same thing. And I assume that as yet no consideration has occurred to my intellect to convince me of the one alternative rather than the other. Certainly in virtue of this very fact I am indifferent about whether to affirm or to deny either alternative, or even whether to make no judgment at all in the matter. Moreover, this indifference extends not merely to things about which the intellect knows absolutely nothing, but extends gradually to everything of which the intellect does not have a clear enough knowledge at the very time when the will is deliberating on them. For although probable guesses may pull me in one direction, the mere knowledge that they are only guesses and not certain and indubitable proofs is all it takes to push my ascent in the opposite direction. These last few days have provided me with ample experience on this point, for all the beliefs that I had once held to be most true I supposed to be utterly false, and for the sole reason that I determined that I could somehow raise doubts about them. But if I hold off from making a judgment when I do not perceive what is true with sufficient clarity and distinctness, it is clear that I am acting properly and am not committing an error. But if instead I were to make an assertion or a denial, then I am not using my freedom properly. Were I to select the alternative that is false, then obviously I will be in error. But were I to embrace the other alternative, it will be by sheer luck that I happen upon the truth. But I will still not be without fault, for it is manifest by the light of nature that a perception on the part of the intellect must always precede a determination on the part of the will. Inherent in this incorrect use of free will is the privation that constitutes the very essence of error. The privation, I say, present in this operation insofar as the operation proceeds from me, but not in the faculty given me by God, nor even in its operation insofar as it depends upon him. Indeed, I have no cause for complaint on the grounds that God has not given me a greater power of understanding or a greater light of nature than he has, for it is of the essence of a finite intellect not to understand many things, and it is of the essence of a created intellect to be finite. Actually, instead of thinking that he has withheld from me or deprived me of those things that he has not given me, I ought to thank God, who never owed me anything, for what he has bestowed upon me. Again, I have no cause for complaint on the grounds that God has given me a will that has a wider scope than my intellect, for since the will consists of merely one thing, something indivisible as it were, it does not seem that its nature could withstand anything being removed from it. Indeed, the more ample the will is, the more I ought to thank the one who gave it to me. Finally, I should not complain because God concurs with me in eliciting those acts of the will, that is, those judgments, in which I am mistaken. For insofar as those acts depend on God, they are absolutely true and good, and in a certain sense there is greater perfection in me being able to elicit those acts than in not being able to do so. But privation, in which alone the defining characteristic of falsehood and wrongdoing is to be found, has no need whatever of God's concurrence, since privation is not a thing, nor, when it is related to God as its cause, is it to be called a privation, but simply a negation. For it is surely no imperfection in God that he has given me the freedom to give or withhold my assent in those instances where he has not placed a clear and distinct perception in my intellect. But surely it is an imperfection in me that I do not use my freedom well, and that I make judgments about things I do not properly understand. Nevertheless, I see that God could easily have brought it about that while still being free and having finite knowledge, I should nonetheless never make a mistake. This result could have been achieved either by his endowing my intellect with a clear and distinct perception of everything about which I would ever deliberate, or by simply impressing the following rule so firmly upon my memory that I could never forget it. I should never judge anything that I do not clearly and distinctly understand. I readily understand that, considered as a totality, I would have been more perfect than I am now, had God made me that way. But I cannot therefore deny that it may somehow be a greater perfection in the universe as a whole, that some of its parts are not immune to error, while others are, than if all of them were exactly alike. And I have no right to complain that the part God had wished me to play is not the principal and most perfect one of all. Furthermore, even if I cannot abstain from errors in the first way mentioned above, which depends upon a clear perception of everything about which I must deliberate, nevertheless I can avoid error in the other way, which depends solely on my remembering to abstain from making judgments whenever the truth of a given matter is not apparent. For although I experience a certain infirmity in myself, namely that I am unable to keep my attention constantly focused on one and the same item of knowledge, nevertheless, by attentive and often repeated meditation, I can bring it about that I call this rule to mind whenever the situation calls for it, and thus I would acquire a certain habit of not erring. Since herein lies the greatest and chief perfection of man, I think today's meditation, in which I investigated the cause of error and falsity, was quite profitable. Nor can this cause be anything other than the one I have described, for as often as I restrain my will when I make judgments, so that it extends only to those matters that the intellect clearly and distinctly discloses to it, it plainly cannot happen that I err. For every clear and distinct perception is surely something, and hence it cannot come from nothing. On the contrary, it must necessarily have God for its author. God, I say, that supremely perfect being to whom it is repugnant to be a deceiver, therefore the perception is most assuredly true. Today I have learned not merely what I must avoid so as never to make a mistake, but at the same time what I must do to attain truth. For I will indeed attain it, if only I pay enough attention to all of the things that I perfectly understand, and separate them off from the rest, which I apprehend more confusedly and more obscurely. I will be conscientious about this in the future. Meditation 5, concerning the essence of material things, and again concerning God, that he exists. Several matters remain for me to examine concerning the attributes of God and myself, that is, concerning the nature of my mind. But perhaps I will take these up at some other time. For now, since I have noted what to avoid and what to do in order to attain the truth, nothing seems more pressing than that I try to free myself from the doubts into which I fell a few days ago, and that I see whether anything certain is to be had concerning material things. Yet before inquiring whether any such things exist outside me, I surely ought to consider the ideas of these things insofar as they exist in my thought, and see which ones are distinct and which ones are confused. I do indeed distinctly imagine the quantity that philosophers commonly call continuous, that is, the extension of this quantity, or rather of the thing quantified in length, breadth, and depth. I enumerate the various parts in it. I ascribe to these parts any sizes, shapes, positions, and local movements whatever. To these movements I ascribe any durations whatever. Not only are these things manifestly known and transparent to me, viewed thus in a general way, but also when I focus my attention on them, I perceive countless particulars concerning shapes, number, movement, and the like. Their truth is so open and so much in accord with my nature that when I first discover them, it seems I am not so much learning something new as recalling something I knew beforehand. In other words, it seems as though I am noticing things for the first time that were in fact in me for a long while, although I had not previously directed a mental gaze upon them. What I believe must be considered above all here is the fact that I find within me countless ideas of certain things that, even if perhaps they do not exist anywhere outside me, still cannot be said to be nothing, and although in a sense I think them at will, nevertheless they are not something I have fabricated. Rather, they have their own true and immutable natures. For example, when I imagine a triangle, even if perhaps no such figure exists outside my thought anywhere in the world and never has, the triangle still has a certain determinate nature, essence, or form which is unchangeable and eternal, which I did not fabricate, and which does not depend on my mind. This is evident from the fact that various properties can be demonstrated regarding this triangle, namely that its 3 angles are equal to 2 right angles, that its longest side is opposite its largest angle, and so on. These are properties I now clearly acknowledge, whether I want to or not, even if I previously had given them no thought whatever when I imagined the triangle. For this reason, then, they were not fabricated by me. It is irrelevant for me to say that perhaps the idea of a triangle came to me from external things, through the sense organs, because of course I have on occasion seen triangle-shaped bodies, for I can think of countless other figures, concerning which there can be no suspicion of their ever having entered me through the senses, and yet I can demonstrate various properties of these figures, no less than I can those of the triangle. All these properties are patently true because I know them clearly, and thus they are something and not merely nothing. For it is obvious that whatever is true is something, and have already demonstrated at some length that all that I know clearly is true. And even if I had not demonstrated this, certainly the nature of my mind is such that nevertheless I cannot refrain from assenting to these things, at least while I perceive them clearly. And I recall that even before now, when I used to keep my attention glued to the objects of the senses, I always took the truths I clearly recognized regarding figures, numbers, or other things pertaining to arithmetic, geometry, or in general, to pure and abstract mathematics to be the most certain of all. But if from the mere fact that I can bring forth from my thought the idea of something, it follows that all that I clearly and distinctly perceive to belong to that thing really does belong to it, then cannot this too be a basis for an argument proving the existence of God? Clearly the idea of God, that is, the idea of a supremely perfect being, is one I discover to be no less within me than the idea of any figure or number, and that it belongs to God's nature that he always exists is something I understand no less clearly and distinctly than is the case when I demonstrate in regard to some figure or number that something also belongs to the nature of that figure or number. Thus, even if not everything that I have meditated upon during these last few days were true, still the existence of God ought to have for me at least the same degree of certainty that truths of mathematics had until now. However, this point is not wholly obvious at first, but has a certain look of sophism about it. Since in all other matters I have become accustomed to distinguishing existence from essence, I easily convince myself that it can be separated from God's essence, and hence that God cannot be thought of as not existing. But nevertheless, it is so obvious to anyone who pays close attention that existence can no more be separated from God's essence than its having 3 angles equal to 2 right angles can be separated from the essence of a triangle, or that the idea of a valley can be separated from the idea of a mountain. Thus it is no less contradictory to think of God, that is, purely a supremely perfect being, lacking existence, that is, lacking some perfection, than it is to think of a mountain without a valley. But granted, I can no more think of God as not existing than I can think of a mountain with a valley. Nevertheless, it surely does not follow from the fact that I think of a mountain without a valley that a mountain exists in the world. Likewise, from the fact that I think of God as existing, it does not seem to follow that God exists, for my thought imposes no necessity on things. And just as one may imagine a winged horse without there being a horse that has wings, in the same way perhaps I can attach existence to God even though no God exists. But there's a sophism lurking here. From the fact that I am unable to think of a mountain without a valley, it does not follow that a mountain or a valley exists anywhere, but only that, whether they exist or not, a mountain and a valley are inseparable from one another. But from the fact that I cannot think of God except as existing, it follows that existence is inseparable from God, and that for this reason he really exists. Not that my thought brings this about or imposes any necessity on anything, but rather the necessity of the thing itself, namely the existence of God, forces me to think this. For I am not free to think of God without existence, that is, a supremely perfect being without a supreme perfection, as I am to imagine a horse with or without wings. Further, it should not be said here that even though I surely need to assent to the existence of God, once I have asserted that God has all perfections and that existence is one of these perfections, nevertheless that earlier assertion need not have been made. Likewise, I need not believe that all four-sided figures can be inscribed in a circle, but given that I posit this, it would then be necessary for me to admit that a rhombus can be inscribed in a circle. Yet this is obviously false. For although it is not necessary that I should ever happen upon any thought of God, nevertheless, whenever I am of a mind to think of a being that is first and supreme, and bring forth the idea of God as it were from the storehouse of my mind, I must of necessity ascribe all perfections to him, even if I do not at that time enumerate them all, or take notice of each one individually. This necessity plainly suffices, so that afterwards, when I realize that existence is a perfection, I rightly conclude that a first and supreme being exists. In the same way, there is no necessity for me ever to imagine a triangle, but whenever I do wish to consider a rectilinear figure having but three angles, I must ascribe to it those properties on the basis of which one rightly infers that the three angles of this figure are no greater than two right angles, even though I do not take note of this at the time. But when I inquire as to the figures that may be inscribed in the circle, there is absolutely no need whatever for my thinking that all four-sided figures are of this sort. For that matter, I cannot even fabricate such a thing, so long as I am of a mind to admit that only what I clearly and distinctly understand. Consequently, there is a great difference between false assumptions of this sort and of the true ideas that are inborn in me, the first and chief of which is the idea of God. For there are a great many ways in which I understand that this idea is not an invention that is dependent upon my thought, but it is an image of a true and immutable nature. First, I cannot think of anything aside from God alone to whose essence existence belongs. Next, I cannot understand how there could be two or more gods of this kind. Again, once I have asserted that one God now exists, I plainly see that it is necessary that he has existed from eternity and will endure for eternity. Finally, I perceive from many other features in God, none of which I can remove or change. But whatever type of argument I use, it always comes down to the fact that the only things that fully convince me are those that I clearly and distinctly perceive. And although some of these things that I thus perceive are obvious to everyone, while others are discovered only by those who look more closely and inquire carefully, nevertheless, once they have been discovered, they are considered no less certain than the others. For example, in the case of a right triangle, although it is not readily apparent that the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of the other two sides, as it is that the hypotenuse is opposite of the largest angle, nevertheless, once the former has been ascertained, it is no less believed. However, as far as God is concerned, if I were not overwhelmed by prejudices, and if the images of sensible things were not besieging my thought from all directions, I would certainly acknowledge nothing sooner or more easily than him. For what, in and of itself, is more manifest than that a supreme being exists, that is, that God, to whose essence alone existence belongs, exists. And although I need to pay close attention in order to perceive this, nevertheless, I now am just as certain about this as I am about everything else that seems most certain. Moreover, I observe also that certitude about other things is so dependent on this, that without it nothing can ever be perfectly known. For I am indeed of such a nature that, while I perceive nothing very clearly and distinctly, I cannot help believing it to be true. While I perceive something very clearly and distinctly, I cannot help believing it to be true. Nevertheless, my nature is also such that I cannot focus my mental gaze always on the same thing, so as to perceive it clearly. Often the memory of a previously made judgment may return when I am no longer attending to the arguments on account of which I made such a judgment. Thus, other arguments can be brought forward that would easily make me change my opinion were I ignorant of God, and thus I would never have true and certain knowledge about anything anything but merely fickle and changeable opinions. Thus, for example, when I consider the nature of a triangle, it appears most evident to me, steeped as I am in the principles of geometry, that its 3 angles are equal to 2 right angles. And so long as I attend to its demonstration, I cannot help believing this to be true. But no sooner do I turn the mind's eye away from the demonstration than, however much I still recall that I had observed it most clearly, nevertheless it can easily happen that I entertain doubts about whether it is true, were I ignorant of God. For I can convince myself that I have been so constituted by nature that I might occasionally be mistaken about those things I believe I perceive most evidently, especially when I recall that I have often taken many things to be true and certain, which other arguments have subsequently led me to judge to be false. But once I perceived that there is a God, and also understood at the same time that everything else depends on him, and that he is not a deceiver, I then concluded that everything that I clearly and distinctly perceive is necessarily true. Hence, even if I no longer attend to the reasons leading me to judge this to be true, so long as I merely recall that I did clearly and distinctly observe it, no counter-argument can be brought forward that might force me to doubt it. On the contrary, I have a true and certain knowledge of it, and not just of this one fact, but of everything else that I recall once having demonstrated, as in geometry and so on. For what objections can now be raised against me? That I have been made such that I am often mistaken? But I now know that I cannot be mistaken in matters I plainly understand, that I have taken many things to be true and certain, which subsequently I recognize to be false, but none of these were things I clearly and distinctly perceived. But I was ignorant of this rule for determining the truth, and I believed these things, perhaps for other reasons which I later discovered were less firm. What then remains to be said? That perhaps I am dreaming, as I recently objected against myself, in other words, that everything I am now thinking of is no truer than what occurs to someone who is asleep? Be that as it may, this changes nothing, for certainly, even if I were dreaming, if anything is evident to my intellect, then it is entirely true. And thus I see plainly that the certainty and truth of every science depends exclusively upon the knowledge of the true God, to the extent that, prior to my becoming aware of him, I was incapable of achieving perfect knowledge about anything else. But now it is possible for me to achieve full and certain knowledge about countless things, both about God and other intellectual matters, as well as about the entirety of that corporeal nature which is the object of pure mathematics. Meditation 6. Concerning the existence of material things and the real distinction between mind and body. It remains for me to examine whether material things exist. Indeed, I now know that they can exist, at least insofar as they are the object of pure mathematics, since I clearly and distinctly perceive them. For no doubt God is capable of bringing about everything that I am capable of perceiving in this way, and I have never judged that God was incapable of something except when it was incompatible with my perceiving it distinctly. Moreover, from the faculty of imagination, which I notice I use while dealing with material things, it seems to follow that they exist. For to anyone paying very close attention to what imagination is, it appears to be simply a certain application of the knowing faculty to a body intimately present to it, and which therefore exists. To make this clear, I first examine the difference between imagination and pure intellection. So, for example, when I imagine a triangle, I not only understand that it is a figure bounded by 3 lines, but at the same time I also envisage with the mind's eye those lines as if they were present. And this is what I call imagining. On the other hand, if I want to think about a chiliagon, I certainly understand that it is a figure consisting of 1,000 sides, just as well as I understand that a triangle is a figure consisting of 3 sides, yet I do not imagine those 1,000 sides in the same way, or envisage them as if they were present. And although in that case, because of force of habit, I always imagine something whenever I think about a corporeal thing, I may perchance represent to myself some figure in a confused fashion. Nevertheless, this figure is obviously not a chiliagon. For this figure is really no different from the figure I would represent to myself were I thinking of a myriagon or any other figure with a large number of sides. Nor is this figure of any help in knowing the properties that differentiate a chiliagon from other polygons, but if the figure in question is a pentagon, I surely can understand its figure just as was the case with the chiliagon without the help of my imagination. But I can also imagine a pentagon by turning the mind's eye both to its 5 sides and at the same time to the area bounded by those sides. At this point, I am manifestly aware that I am in need of a particular sort of effort on the part of the mind in order to imagine, one that I do not employ in order to understand. The new effort on the part of the mind clearly shows the difference between imagination and pure intellection. Moreover, I consider that this power of imagining that is in me, insofar as it differs from the power of understanding, is not required for my own essence, that is, the essence of my mind. For were I to be lacking this power, I would nevertheless undoubtedly remain the same entity I am now. Thus it seems to follow that the power of imagining depends upon something distinct from me, and I readily understand that were a body to exist in which a mind is so joined that it may apply itself in order, as it were, to look at it any time it wishes, it could happen that it is by means of this very body that I imagine corporeal things. As a result, this mode of thinking may differ from pure intellection only in the sense that the mind, when it understands, in a sense turns toward itself and looks at one of the ideas that are in it, whereas when it imagines, it turns toward the body, and intuits in the body something that conforms to an idea either understood by the mind or perceived by sense. To be sure, I easily understand that the imagination can be actualized in this way, provided a body does exist. And since I can think of no other way of explaining imagination that is equally appropriate, I make a probable conjecture from this that a body exists. But this is only a probability, and even though I may examine everything carefully, nevertheless I do not yet see how the distinct idea of corporeal nature that I find in my imagination can enable me to develop an argument which necessarily concludes that some body exists. But I am in the habit of imagining many things over and above that corporeal nature which is the object of pure mathematics, such as colors, sounds, tastes, pain, and the like, though not so distinctly, and I perceive these things better by means of the senses, from which, with the aid of the memory, they seem to have arrived at the imagination. Thus I should pay the same degree of attention to the senses, so that I might deal with them more appropriately. I must see whether I can obtain any reliable argument for the existence of corporeal things from those things that are perceived by the mode of thinking that I call sense. First of all, to be sure, I will review here all the things I previously believed to be true because I had perceived them by means of the senses, and the causes I had for thinking this. Next I will assess the causes why I later called them into doubt. Finally, I will consider what I must now believe about these things. So first, I sensed that I had a head, hands, feet, and other members that comprise this body, which I viewed as a part of me, or perhaps even as the whole of me. I sensed that this body was found among many other bodies by which my body can be affected in various beneficial or harmful ways. I gauged what was opportune by means of a certain sensation of pleasure, and what was inopportune by a sensation of pain. In addition to pain and pleasure, I also sensed within me hunger, thirst, and other such appetites, as well as certain bodily tendencies toward mirth, sadness, anger, and other such affects. And externally, besides the extension, shapes, and motions of bodies, I also sensed their hardness, heat, and other tactile qualities. I also sensed light, colors, odors, tastes, and sounds, on the basis of whose variety I distinguished the sky, the earth, the seas, and the other bodies, one from the other. Now, given the ideas of all these qualities that presented themselves to my thought, and which were all that I properly and immediately sensed, still it was surely not without reason that I thought I sensed things that were manifestly different from my thought, namely, the bodies from which these ideas proceeded. For I knew by experience that these ideas came upon me utterly without my consent, to the extent that, wish as I may, I could not sense any object unless it was present to a sense organ, nor could I fail to sense it when it was present. And since the ideas perceived by sense were much more vivid and explicit, and even, in their own way, more distinct than any of those that I deliberately and knowingly formed through meditation, or that I found impressed on my memory, it seemed impossible that they came from myself. Thus the remaining alternative was that they came from other things. Since I had no knowledge of such things except from those same ideas themselves, I could not help entertaining the thought that they were similar to those ideas. Moreover, as I also recalled, that the use of the senses antedated the use of reason. And since I saw that the ideas that I myself fashioned were not as explicit as those that I perceived through the faculty of sense, and were for the most part composed of parts of the latter, I easily convinced myself that I had absolutely no idea in the intellect that I did not have beforehand in the sense faculty. Not without reason did I judge that this body, which by a certain special right I called mine, belongs more to me than did any other, for I could never be separated from it in the same way I could be from other bodies. I sensed all appetites and feelings in and on behalf of it. Finally, I noticed pain and pleasurable excitement in its parts, and not in other bodies external to it. But why should a certain sadness of spirit arise from some sensation or other of pain, and why should a certain elation arise from a sensation of excitement, or why should that peculiar twitching in the stomach, which I call hunger, warn me to have something to eat, or why should dryness in the throat warn me to take something to drink, and so on? I plainly had no explanation other than that I had been taught this way by nature, for there's no affinity whatsoever, at least none I am aware of, between this twitching in the stomach and the will to have something to eat, or between the sensation of something causing pain and the thought of sadness arising from this sensation. But nature also seems to have taught me everything else as well that I judged concerning the objects of the senses, for I had already convinced myself that this was how things were prior to my assessing any of the arguments that might prove it. Afterwards, however, many experiences gradually weakened any faith that I had in the senses. Towers that had seemed round from afar occasionally appeared square at close quarters. Very large statues mounted on their pedestals did not seem large to someone looking at them from ground level, and in countless other such instances I determined that judgments in matters of the external senses were in error, and not just the external senses, but the internal senses as well, for what can be more intimate than pain? But I had sometimes heard it said by people whose leg or arm had been amputated that it seemed to them that they still occasionally sensed pain in the very limb they had lost. Thus, even in my own case, it did not seem to be entirely certain that some bodily member was causing me pain, even though I did sense pain in it. To these causes for doubt, I recently added two quite general ones. The first was that everything I ever thought I sensed while awake, I could believe I also sometimes sensed while asleep. And since I had not believed that what I seemed to sense in my dreams comes to me from things external to me, I saw no reason why I should hold this belief about those things I seemed to be sensing while awake. The second was that, since I was still ignorant of the author of my origin, or at least pretended to be ignorant of it, I saw nothing to prevent my having been so constituted by nature that I should be mistaken even about what seemed to me most true. As to the arguments that used to convince me of the truth of sensible things, I found no difficulty responding to them, for since I seemed driven by nature toward many things about which reason tried to dissuade me, I did not think that what I was taught by nature deserved much credence, and even though the perceptions of the senses did not depend upon my will, I did not think that we must therefore conclude that they came from things distinct from me, since perhaps there is some faculty in me, as yet unknown to me, that produces these perceptions. But now, having begun to have a better knowledge of myself and the author of my origin, I am of the opinion that I must not rashly admit everything that I seem to derive from the senses, but neither, for that matter, should I call everything into doubt. First, I know that all the things that I clearly and distinctly understand can be made by God, such as I understand them. For this reason, my ability clearly and distinctly to understand one thing without another suffices to make me certain that the one thing is different from the other, since they can be separated from each other, at least by God. The question as to the sort of power that might affect such a separation is not relevant to their being thought to be different. For this reason, from the fact that I know that I exist, and that at the same time I judge that obviously nothing else belongs to my nature or essence except that I am a thinking thing, I rightly conclude that my essence consists entirely in my being a thinking thing, and although perhaps, or rather as I shall soon say, assuredly, I have a body that is very closely joined to me. Nevertheless, because on the one hand I have a clear and distinct idea of myself, insofar as I am merely a thinking thing and not an extended thing, and because on the other hand I have a distinct idea of a body, insofar it is merely an extended thing and not a thinking thing, it is certain that I am really distinct from my body and can exist without it. Moreover, I find in myself faculties for certain special modes of thinking, namely the faculties of imagining and sensing. I can clearly and distinctly understand myself in my entirety without these faculties, but not vice versa. I cannot understand them clearly and distinctly without me, that is, without a substance endowed with understanding in which they inhere, for they include an act of understanding in their formal concept. Thus I perceive them to be distinguished from me as modes from a thing. I also acknowledge that there are certain other faculties, such as those moving from one place to another, or of taking on various shapes and so on, that, like sensing or imagining, cannot be understood apart from some substance in which they inhere, and hence without which they cannot exist. But it is clear that these faculties, if in fact they exist, must be in a corporeal or extended substance, not in a substance endowed with understanding. For some extension is contained in a clear and distinct concept of them, though certainly not any understanding. Now, there clearly is in me a passive faculty of sensing, that is, a faculty for receiving and knowing the ideas of sensible things, but I could not use it unless there also existed, either in me or in something else, a certain active faculty of producing or bringing about these ideas. But this faculty surely cannot be in me, since it clearly presupposes no act of understanding, and these ideas are produced without my cooperation, often even against my will. Therefore, the only alternative is that it is in some substance different from me, containing either formally or eminently all the reality that exists objectively in the ideas produced by that faculty, as I have just noted above. Hence, the substance is either a body, that is, a corporeal nature, which contains formally all that is contained objectively in the ideas, or else it is or else it is God, or some other creature more noble than a body, which contains eminently all that is contained objectively in the ideas. But since God is not a deceiver, it is patently obvious that he does not send me these ideas either immediately by himself, or even through the mediation of some creature that contains the objective reality of these ideas not formally, but only eminently. For since God has given me no faculty whatsoever for making this determination, but instead has given me a great inclination to believe that these ideas issue from corporeal things, I fail to see how God could be understood not to be a deceiver, if these things were to issue from a source other than corporeal things. And consequently, corporeal things exist. Nevertheless, perhaps not all bodies exist exactly as I grasp them by sense, since this sensory grasp is in many cases very obscure and confused. But at least they do contain everything I clearly and distinctly understand, that is, everything considered in a general sense that is encompassed in the object of pure mathematics. As far as the remaining matters are concerned, which are either merely particular, for example, that the sun is such and such a size or shape, and so on, or less clearly understood, for example, light, sound, pain, and the like, even though these matters are very doubtful and uncertain, nevertheless, the fact that God is no deceiver, and thus no falsity can be found in my opinions, unless there is also in me a faculty given me by God for the purpose of rectifying this falsity, offers me a definite hope of reaching the truth even in these matters. And surely there is no doubt that all that I am taught by nature has some truth in it. For by nature, taken generally, I understand nothing other than God himself, or the ordered network of created things which was instituted by God. By my own particular nature, I understand nothing other than the combination of all the things bestowed upon me by God. There's nothing that this nature teaches me more explicitly than that I have a body that is ill-disposed when I feel pain, that needs food and drink when I suffer hunger or thirst, and the like. Therefore I should not doubt that there is some truth in this. By means of these sensations of pain, hunger, thirst, and so on, nature also teaches that I am present not merely to my body in the way a sailor is present in a ship, but that I am most tightly joined and, so to speak, commingled with it, so much so that I and the body constitute one single thing. For if this were not the case, then I, who am only a thinking thing, would not sense pain when the body is injured. Rather, I would perceive the wound by means of pure intellect, just as a sailor perceives by sight whether anything in his ship is broken. And when the body is in need of food or drink, I should understand this explicitly instead of having confused sensations of hunger and thirst. For clearly these sensations of thirst, hunger, pain, and so on are nothing but certain confused modes of thinking arising from the union, and as it were, the commingling of the mind with the body. Moreover, I am also taught by nature that various other bodies exist around my body, some of which are to be pursued, while others are to be avoided. And to be sure, from the fact that I sense a wide variety of colors, sounds, odors, tastes, levels of heat, and grades of roughness, and the like, I rightly conclude that in the bodies from which these different perceptions of the senses proceed, there are differences corresponding to the different perceptions, though perhaps the latter do not resemble the former. And from the fact that some of these perceptions are pleasant while others are unpleasant, it is plainly certain that my body, or rather my whole self, insofar as I am comprised of a body and a mind, can be affected by various beneficial and harmful bodies in the vicinity. Granted, there are many other things that I seem to have been taught by nature. Nevertheless, it was not really nature that taught them to me, but a certain habit of making reckless judgments. And thus, it could easily happen that these judgments are false. For example, that any space where there is absolutely nothing happening to move my senses is empty, or that there is something in a hot body that bears an exact likeness to the idea of heat that is in me, or that in a white or green body there is the same whiteness or greenness that I sense, or that in a bitter or sweet body there is the same taste, and so on, or that stars and towers and any other distant bodies have the same size and shape that they present to my senses, and other things of this sort. But to ensure that my perceptions in this matter are sufficiently distinct, I ought to define more precisely what exactly I mean when I say that I am taught something by nature, for I am taking nature here more narrowly than the combination of everything bestowed on me by God. For this combination embraces many things that belong exclusively to the mind, such as my perceiving that what has been done cannot be undone, and everything else that is known by the light of nature. That is not what I am talking about here. There are also many things that belong exclusively to the body, such as that it tends to move downward, and so on. I am not dealing with these either, but only with what God has bestowed on me, insofar as I am composed of mind and body. Accordingly, it is this nature that teaches me to avoid things that produce a sensation of pain, and to pursue things that produce a sensation of pleasure, and the like. But it does not appear that nature teaches us to conclude anything besides these things from these sense perceptions, unless the intellect has first conducted its own inquiry regarding things external to us, for it seems to belong exclusively to the mind and not to the composite of mind and body to know the truth in these matters. Thus, although a star affects my eye no more than does the flame from a small torch, still there is no real or positive tendency in my eye toward believing that the star is no larger than the flame. Yet ever since my youth I have made this judgment without any reason for doing so, and although I feel heat as I draw closer to the fire, and I also feel pain upon drawing too close to it, there is not a single argument that persuades me that there is something in the fire similar to that heat, any more than to that pain. On the contrary, I am convinced only that there is something in the fire that, regardless of what it finally turns out to be, causes in us those sensations of heat or pain. And although there may be nothing in a given space that moves the senses, it does not therefore follow that there is no body in it. But I see that in these and many other instances I have been in the habit of subverting the order of nature. For admittedly I use the perceptions of the senses, which are properly given by nature only for signifying to the mind what things are useful or harmful to the composite of which it is a part, and to that extent they are clear and distinct enough, as reliable rules for immediately discerning what is the essence of bodies located outside us, yet they signify nothing about that except quite obscurely and confusedly. I have already examined in sufficient detail how it could happen that my judgments are false despite the goodness of God, but a new difficulty now arises regarding those very things that nature shows me are either to be sought out or avoided, as well as the internal sensations where I seem to have detected errors, for example, when someone is deluded by a food's pleasant taste to eat the poison hidden inside it. In this case, however, he is driven by nature only toward desiring the thing in which the pleasurable taste is found, but not toward the poison, of which he obviously is unaware. I can only conclude that this nature is not omniscient. This is not remarkable, since man is a limited thing, and thus only what is of limited perfection befits him. But we infrequently err even in those things to which nature impels us. Take, for example, the case of those who are ill and desire food or drink that will soon afterwards be injurious to them. Perhaps it could be said here that they erred because their nature was corrupt. However, this does not remove our difficulty, for a sick man is no less a creature of God than a healthy one, and thus it seems no less inconsistent that the sick man got a deception-prone nature from God, and a clock made of wheels and counterweights follows all the laws of nature no less closely when it has been badly constructed and does not tell time accurately than it does when it completely satisfies the wish of its maker. Likewise, I might regard a man's body as a kind of mechanism that is outfitted with and composed of bones, nerves, muscles, veins, blood, and skin in such a way that even if no mind existed in it, the man's body would still exhibit all the same motions that are in it now, except for those motions that proceed either from a command of the will or consequently from the mind. I easily recognize that it could be natural for this body, were it, say, suffering from dropsy and experiencing dryness in the throat, which typically produces a thirst sensation in the mind, and also so disposed by its nerves and other parts to take something to drink, the result of which would be to exacerbate the illness. This is as natural as for a body without any such illness to be moved by the same dryness in the throat to take something to drink that is useful to it. And given the intended purpose of the clock, I could say that it deviates from its nature when it fails to tell the right time. And similarly, considering the mechanism of the human body in terms of its being equipped for the motions that typically occur in it, I may think that it is too deviating from its nature if its throat were dry when having something to drink is not beneficial to its conservation. Nevertheless, I am well aware that this last use of nature greatly differs from the other. For this latter, nature is merely a designation dependent on my thought, since it compares a man in poor health and a poorly constructed clock with the ideas of a healthy man and of a well-made clock. A designation extrinsic to the things to which it is applied. But by nature, taken in the former sense, I understand something that is really in things, and thus is not without some truth. When we say, then, in the case of the body suffering from dropsy, that its nature is corrupt, given the fact that it has a parched throat and yet does not need something to drink, nature obviously is merely an extrinsic designation. Nevertheless, in the case of the composite, that is, of a mind joined to such a body, it is not a mere designation, but a true error of nature that this body should be thirsty when having something to drink would be harmful to it. It therefore remains to inquire here how the goodness of God does not prevent nature, thus considered, from being deceptive. Now, my first observation here is that there is a great difference between a mind and a body, in that a body, by its very nature, is always divisible. On the other hand, the mind is utterly indivisible. For when I consider the mind, that is, myself insofar as I am only a thinking thing, I cannot distinguish any parts within me. Rather, I understand myself to be manifestly one complete thing. Although the entire mind seems to be united to the entire body, nevertheless, were a foot or an arm or any other bodily part to be amputated, I know that nothing has been taken away from the mind on that account. Nor can the faculties of willing, sensing, understanding, and so on be called parts of the mind, since it is one and the same mind that wills, senses, and understands. On the other hand, there is no corporeal or extended thing I can think of that I may not in my thought easily divide into parts, and in this way I understand that it is divisible. This consideration alone would suffice to teach me that the mind is wholly diverse from the body, had I not yet known it well enough in any other way. My second observation is that my mind is not immediately affected by all of the parts of the body, but only by the brain, or perhaps even just one small part of the brain, namely by that part where the common sense is said to reside. Whenever this part of the brain is disposed in the same manner, it presents the same thing to the mind, even if the other parts of the body are able, meanwhile, to be related in diverse ways. Countless experiments show this, none of which need be reviewed here. My next observation is that the nature of the body is such that whenever any of its parts can be moved by another part some distance away, it can also be moved in the same manner by any of the parts that lie between them, even if this more distant part is doing nothing. For example, in the chord ABCD, if the final part D is pulled, the first part A would be moved in exactly the same manner as it could be if one of the intermediate parts B or C were pulled, while the end part D remained immobile. Likewise, when I feel pain in my foot, physics teaches me that this sensation took place by means of nerves distributed throughout the foot like stretched cords extending from the foot all the way to the brain. When these nerves are pulled in the foot, they also pull on the inner parts of the brain to which they extend and produce a certain motion in them. This motion has been constituted by nature so as to affect the mind with the sensation of pain as if it occurred in the foot. But because these nerves need to pass through the shin, thigh, loins, back, and neck to get from the foot to the brain, it can happen that even if it is not the part in the foot, but merely one of the intermediate parts that is being struck, the very same movement will occur in the brain that would occur were the foot badly injured. The inevitable result will be that the mind feels the same pain. The same opinion should hold for any other sensation. My final observation is that since any given motion occurring in that part of the brain immediately affecting the mind produces but one sensation in it, I can think of no better arrangement than that it produces the one sensation that, of all the ones it is able to produce, it is most especially and most often conducive to the maintenance of a healthy man. Moreover, all experience shows that all the sensations bestowed on us by nature are like this. Hence, there is absolutely nothing to be found in them that does not bear witness to God's power and goodness. Thus, for example, when the nerves in the foot are agitated in a violent and unusual manner, this motion of theirs extends through the marrow of the spine to the inner reaches of the brain, where it gives the mind the sign to sense something, namely, the pain as if it is occurring in the foot. This provokes the mind to do its utmost to move away from the cause of the pain, since it is seen as harmful to the foot. But the nature of man could have been so constituted by God that this same motion in the brain might have indicated something else to the mind. For example, either the motion itself as it occurs in the brain, or in the foot, or in some place in between, or something else entirely different. But nothing else would have served so well the maintenance of the body. Similarly, when we need something to drink, a certain dryness arises in the throat that moves the nerves in the throat, and by means of them, the inner parts of the brain. And this motion affects the mind with the sensation of thirst, because in this entire affair, nothing is more useful for us to know than that we need something to drink in order to maintain our health. The same holds in the other cases. From these considerations, it is utterly apparent that, notwithstanding the immense goodness of God, the nature of man, insofar as it is composed of mind and body, cannot help being sometimes mistaken. For if some cause, not in the foot, but in some other part through which the nerves extend from the foot to the brain, or perhaps even in the brain itself, were to produce the same motion that would normally be produced by a badly injured foot, the pain will be felt as if it were in the foot, and the senses will naturally be deceived. For since an identical motion in the brain can only bring about an identical sensation in the mind, and it is more frequently the case that this motion is wont to arise on account of a cause that harms the foot than on account of some other thing existing elsewhere, it is reasonable that the motion should always show pain to the mind as something belonging to the foot rather than to some other part. And if dryness in the throat does not arise, as is normal, because taking something to drink contributes to bodily health, but from a contrary cause, as happens in the case of someone with dropsy, then it is far better that it should deceive on that occasion than that it should always be deceptive when the body is in good health. The same holds for the other cases. This consideration is most helpful, not only for my noticing all the errors to which my nature is liable, but also for enabling me to correct or avoid them without difficulty. To be sure, I know that all the senses set forth what is true more frequently than what is false regarding what concerns the welfare of the body. Moreover, I can nearly always make use of several of them in order to examine the same thing. Furthermore, I can use my memory, which connects current happenings with past ones, and my intellect, which now has examined all the causes of error. Hence, I should no longer fear that those things that are daily shown me by the senses are false. On the contrary, the hyperbolic doubts of the last few days ought to be rejected as ludicrous. This goes especially for the chief reason of doubting, which dealt with my failure to distinguish between sleep from being awake, for I now notice that there is a considerable difference between these two. Dreams are never joined by the memory with all the other actions of life, as is the case with those actions that occur when one is awake. For surely, if while I am awake, someone were suddenly to appear to me and then immediately disappear, as occurs in dreams, so that I neither see where he came from nor where he went, it is not without reason that I would judge him to be a ghost or a phantom conjured up in my brain. brain rather than a true man. But when these things happen, and I notice distinctly where they come from, where they are now, and when they come to me, and when I connect my perception of them without interruption with the whole of the rest of my life, I am clearly certain that these perceptions have happened to me not while I was dreaming, but while I was awake. Nor ought I have even the least doubt regarding the truth of these things if, having mustered all the senses, in addition to my memory and my intellect, in order to examine them, nothing is passed on to me by one of those sources that conflicts with the others. For from the fact that God is no deceiver, it follows that I am in no way mistaken in these matters. But because the need to get things done does not always permit us the leisure for such a careful inquiry, we must confess that the life of man is apt to commit errors regarding particular things, and we must acknowledge the infirmity of our nature.